How are you? How are the discussions?
Wonderful.
You were great.
Yeah.
Good.
Fabulous.
Yeah. Excited? Are you happy to bring the solutions and everything that you've been discussing here to our audience, online and offline? That's great. We're gonna have 25 minutes to talk about that. And maybe I will start with Philip. So please tell us all what you've been discussing, how are the solutions you're bringing on the table?
Thank you. So yes, we had 2 hours together for the Project Hope conversation. This was a little bit of news about the organizational logistics of putting the international panel on the information environment together, some sharing some of the new knowledge from the analysis, the meta-analysis and the systematic reviews that we did. And I think overall the conversation was really shaped by a nugget of wisdom we got from President McNutt yesterday about how science was a process, not a list of facts. So most of our conversation was about how difficult it is to produce the new knowledge, especially involving social media platforms, complex organizational patterns, and many different kinds of disciplines. So we had a number of humanists in the crowd, we had a number of our psychologists and neuroscientists. We showed off the outcomes from this meta-analysis and the systemic review, which really helps us identify that flagging and corrective information seems to have a positive impact on public learning, retention of information, trust in the systems. But for our purposes, one of the interesting findings is how little evidence there is for all the other proposed solutions. And of the 4,500 papers that we processed in the meta-analysis, a surprising number of them suggest solutions, but only at the end, at the conclusion of an article. Right? There's no testing on the solution set. And so part of the conversation actually became about getting us as researchers to aspire to reach the gold standard of what can go into a meta-analysis in terms of reporting our statistics, to reach for those models and those forms of tests that allow for stronger causal claims. And I think by the end of it, we were all well aware, painfully aware of how dependent we are on Twitter for text data, right? So our toolkit for processing large amounts of text is now fairly well developed. But a significant portion of the information that might be sexist or racist or targeting particular communities in manipulative ways is visual. And that, for the moment, is a challenge for us as researchers. So we went into the organizational logistics. We showed off some of those results, which will be on the IPIE website in the next week to 10 days. And we started to sketch out what's ahead, which domains of scientific consensus we might find as we strike panels in the near future.
Thank you so much, Philip. That's fascinating, and thank you for the input out from the researcher side and how we can actually make change in looking at this information from technological perspective. Before I'm going to move to Anna, I'm going to ask to switch off the time because the clock is not working in here, and I'm sure that we can talk for hours, but I would love to kind of make sure that we're all going to finish at 5 as we plan. So. Anna, please tell us what you've been discussing on the Mercury project panel, and I've been there as well. Fascinating discussions. I know that you were actually coming together in bringing the solutions, so please.
Thank you. And a nice segue, because the Mercury Project is a coalition of over 100 social and behavioral scientists who are trying to test solutions to the problem of our information environment. And our solution session was tasked with, we broke into small groups, and each group was tasked with finding at least one solution, or proposing at least one solution based in behavioral science that could potentially address both health and climate mis and disinformation. And then we voted on the solutions, and I'm bringing you the top 2 solutions from our session. And both of the solutions, the top 2 solutions, focused on the challenge for a layperson, a non-scientist, in distinguishing between areas of scientific consensus and areas of scientific uncertainty, and then fringe or non-consensus opinions in the scientific community. And both of our solutions leverage existing things that exist in the world that we thought could be scaled or expanded to address health and climate misinformation. So one of our small groups focused on the problem of the diversity of opinion in the scientific community. That group was joined by Dr. Anthony Fauci, who recounted some of the difficulties that that faced him both during the AIDS crisis and during the COVID crisis, when there was a high degree of scientific consensus about the medicine, about the science. But just as on any given issue, even if 98% of the scientists agree on a particular issue, it may very well be the case that there are one or two scientists who hold a dissenting view. The problem is when those dissenting views are elevated by the news media or by politicians to in an equivalence, what Dr. Fauci called an equivalence of experts. And so maybe, both experts are members of the National Academy, both have distinguished publication records, and so the news media can kind of both sides the issue. And so he said, help me with this. And so that group came up with the idea that we have something called expert survey panels. So one good example is run out of the University of Chicago and is a survey panel of about 90 economists. And they're surveyed regularly, multiple times per month sometimes, on policy issues that are facing our legislators, our decision makers, and they're asked both to predict what effect a particular policy would have, but also to confidence weight their predictions so that we can see where there's more and less uncertainty. So if you go to the survey panel webpage, the most recent one was on the effects of banning TikTok. The one before that was on the productivity effects of AI. So these are pressing things where we may not know the answer, but if you aggregate over 90 highly qualified experts, you can see what the distribution of opinion looks like. And it would allow the non-economist, and in the case of health and climate, the person who's not a climate scientist, who's not an epidemiologist or an expert on infectious diseases, to at least see, okay, this opinion must be an outlier because I can see where the middle of the scientific consensus is. And the last thing that group pointed out, and this maybe tipped it over, is that we actually do have experimental evidence that when you show non-scientists, citizens, particularly in climate science, when you show respondents the degree of scientific consensus that exists on climate science, it can move their opinions in the direction of believing the science. So that was one solution. The second solution was really analogous, but focused on the problem of predatory or for-profit scientific journals. So, in a world in which there's lots and lots of scientific journals, and again, media outlets and politicians can create this equivalence of scientific opinion because it was published in a scientific journal, even though that journal is not highly respected in the scientific community, it's hard for the layperson to distinguish. So that solution said, well, we have an organization already called NewsGuard that provides reliability ratings for journalistic outlets. Maybe we need something like that for our academic journals, something like Journal Guard, where we have the National Academies of Science or the NIH could rate the credibility of scientific journals, which would give consumers a signal about the credibility of scientific findings. So we thought those were both pretty good, and we have 45 minutes to come up with solutions. I think in general there was a lot of excitement in the room about the opportunity to develop and test and hopefully pilot and then scale solutions that work.
Perfect. Thank you so much for bringing that and bringing actually two very specific solutions on the table as well. Hailey, how about you? What was the discussion on inclusion against disinformation? What are the outcomes?
Yeah, so we paid a lot of attention about how specific data points impact specific marginalized communities, what that looks like offline and online, both in the global north and south, as well as Latina communities, Jewish communities, and others. We went a lot into the weaponization of algorithms based on the data that cohort these specific groups and silo them into all of us into very specific networked ways of viewing the world. One example would be if somebody has an aggressive data pattern that they're pushing off across their devices, they're likely going to see information that directly has to do with that. So there were a lot of really incredible points, like this being an absolutely wicked problem that takes many tiers to deal with. There's a technical component, there's a social component. We landed on digital literacy, catered for specific communities encompassing media literacy that specifically speak to those communities and kind of taking back the algorithm, weaponizing the algorithm for propagating the appropriate information. And then, of course, that's an existential dilemma as well, right? Who gets to choose what information is appropriate? But we want to use the data to about ourselves to maybe rewire the way the algorithms work to maybe identify those super spreaders of disinformation before it becomes a content moderation issue. If they're able to collect all of this data on us as it is, instead of nonprofits and civil society and academics going and begging for content moderation that may or may not be exactly aligned with what it needs to be, cohorting the people that are harming people through the information that they're spreading. The algorithms work on ranking and authority. Who has ranking and authority depends on your network within your cohort and or within your marginalized group. So why aren't we downranking the authority of super spreaders of disinformation or those who aim to harm people through those narratives and through the cyber-enabled tools that they're using to undermine the networks to propagate that information in the first place? So it was a really incredible discussion about we can't take a blanket approach to solving the problem. There is no one solution. There never will be. There will always be algorithms. There will always be media, and there will always be different people with different opinions. And having different opinions is great. It's when those opinions harm other people that it's not. So back to the conclusion of, is there a way we can educate communities stemming locally and validating what they see through the leaders in that community individually, instead of taking one blanket approach to digital or media literacy.
Thank you so much. So how we actually can combat this us versus them narrative, right, through technology. I think that's also very, very important, as it's one of the widely used narratives in the disinformation and by the bad actors. Stephen, I'm coming now to you. You're going to tell us about the session on the 10-point plan, right?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we've had a very wide-ranging discussion, which was both delving into the negative impact, the disinformation, but then also trying as much as possible to focus on solutions. So we split this into three parts. One was about looking at what exactly are online harms and who is most vulnerable and who is most harmed by the platforms and the disinformation. And I think we heard some very moving testimony from people about the particular harms that they had suffered, similar to what Maria Ressa talked about yesterday with a very direct and very impactful overview of what had happened in disinformation, how she'd personally been attacked. And I think we talked a little bit about how these harms particularly happen in the Global South, in the majority world, and they also particularly target underrepresented groups and particularly women as well. So we had a wide-ranging discussion there about how do you mitigate those harms, how do you try and resolve those. The other thing we focused on was the business model of big tech, and had a very lively discussion about the issues of content moderation versus surveillance capitalism, and how you've got to move this argument upstream. So content moderation, of course, is one particular solution, but it's a kind of sticking plaster to the actual problem, which is around the surveillance model of advertising, which is targeting individuals and so on. So we looked at how we need to control that, how Europe has become the default super legislator for big tech, how there are more opportunities there. There's a reluctance in the US in any way to legislate, although there are, I think, opportunities state by state to try and focus on transparency and other elements. But we felt that the more opportunities there are tend to be in Europe. And then we're also seeing how that can be utilized and replicated in other places in the majority world as well, in Brazil, in the Philippines, and other countries as well. Finally, we talked about how to protect journalism as an antidote as well to disinformation and the need to invest in quality, independent, investigative journalism. Ultimately, we endorsed the 10-point plan, which we heard about yesterday, and we had some great breaking news on this, that at the moment it's been signed up to by 270-odd academics, Nobel Prize laureates, foundations, and others. And just yesterday, Margaret Atwood and Naomi Klein have also joined those signatories. So to everybody in the room, we'd say sign it, use it, and share it.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those solutions that are more coming on the regulatory level and also advocacy. I think that indeed it's a high time for US to adopt as well the regulation on disinformation. I'm very proud to be from the European Union and happy that the DSA is in force and hopefully will be very much in force in most of the countries and that we deal that with that from this aspect. I'm hearing so many solutions in here. To the problems, and some of them I feel that they are very kind of coming together as well. And I would like to ask you like kind of hot question. So how do you feel that what you heard from your fellow panelists and what was happening in other breakouts can also inspire you and perhaps can give some possibility to cooperate or work together with the people that you had in your room? Because I also know that different kind of people were in each of the rooms, and I think that can also foster the cooperation. And I'm a huge fan of cooperation. I really believe that we are stronger together. So anyone in particular would like to start and already has an inspiration to talk?
No, one thing I'll say is that we, it's interesting, you probably feel this true too, is that during the pandemic, I think we became so much more painfully aware of the problem of mis and disinformation. But as everybody knows, that problem existed prior to the pandemic. But I think it confronted us in a very real and material way. And I think we also were confronted with the reality that we had maybe underinvested in finding solutions, right? And so now here we are, starting during the pandemic, but trying to take forward an effort to find solutions and wanting our research funding agencies, whether it's the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health or it's the European funding agencies, to recognize the need to invest not only, for example, in the case of climate science, in finding technological solutions, but also finding solutions that target decision-making and behavior, which seem to be almost the key stumbling block now, and the same in health. So I think that was one thing that across the many advocates for different kinds of solutions and people coming from all walks of life was just the recognition that we need to know more than we do, and we need to be willing as societies to invest in learning more.
To your point and to your point, with the data that's collected on each individual and the behavioral analytics that go into getting somebody to act based on the information that we see, and we discussed this in our session as well, we're not really researching enough into the neurological aspect of this, why and how we respond to the patterns. And so but also knowing what data we're putting out ourselves, knowing what cohorts we're in and why, is a way that we can kind of step back as well and say, oh, this is something that impacts me, that emotionally triggers me, and I know that, and it's inferred through the surveillance capitalism, the surveillance data that has collected on me, and am I responding to this in a certain way because it's familiar, because it's an issue? And personally would like to see more research into why that is. Are we pushing on multiple senses at once? Is that the problem? What is it that creates that addiction to that information that we're seeing? And why is it harming us offline?
I think that's super crucial, and we have scientists in the room, and that's definitely something that we can discuss and maybe work on together, because what we see by the bad actors, and but what you said, Stephen, right? It's exactly what harm is being brought to the journalists, but also to the activists. I'm coming from Poland. I also see what the government in Poland is doing to mitigate activists working for example, freedom of press or the right to abortion. It's happening all over the world, and it's happening because it's something that is changing our minds and mitigating the work of those that are trying to fight for freedom. So yeah, Stephen.
I mean, one thing we talked about in our session, which I'm sure has come up, I know, a lot during the last couple of days, is also the increasing capacity of generative AI, which, when we think about disinformation at the moment and the way in which it is produced and distributed, generative AI is going to supercharge that. So, what we will be looking at in a year's time or in 2 years' time is going to be of a scale of magnitude which we can't really imagine. So problem is going to get worse before it's going to get better. And the pace of legislation tends to be very slow. So that's part of the problem, is that you start legislation now, it's going to be 5-10 years before it's introduced, and then you have the implementation gap as well. I mean, we have GDPR in Europe, but in many countries it's not implemented, and there are ways that big tech finds around that as well. So I think that's something that is on the horizon and is a very real and present danger.
Yeah, and that's why I think that if we're talking about all those puzzles, regulations are important, but equally important are money into coming to develop AI in the more ethical way, right? In the way that AI will serve us. Philip.
I just want to say that I've been inspired by at the discovery of how I think we share a sense of mission, right, across journalists and civil society and those of us who do large-scale research. We do have normative goals, and I think one of the nice things about the event has been discovering that science itself needs diplomacy, right? The science diplomacy and working out what good science communication is. It may no longer be possible or make sense to do the research that we want to do without having a science diplomacy strategy or a communication strategy built into the program of the work, if we expect to see good change come from the work that we do.
Thank you very much. I think science needs diplomacy indeed, and needs a good communication, and it needs a space where we can talk about it in the general public, but also needs a space for the expert to come together, and the experts coming together from the different spaces and expertises, and really working on the solutions. And I think that that's what we already did with the 4 working groups. We're going to be harvesting some of this. So thank you so much for joining me here on stage. And thank you so much, all of you, that participated in these groups and brought all of your knowledge into the solutions that are going to be in here. We're going to be working on the report together, so it will be also available. Thank you so much. And right now, I'm inviting as well Omri, but thank you to our panelists. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.